Offshore production versus domestic production. How do you make that decision? What should you keep in mind, or what should you be aware of in order to make the best decision for your brand? So, there are a couple of things that for me are essential to think of and keep in mind when you make that decision, especially the beginning stages when your brand is new. One of them is the price point. Where do you want to price your product, your retail price point? The other part is the quantities, because these two things will determine whether you can produce domestically or not. And if you're going to produce offshore, where you're going to produce offshore and what that would look like. Now, there's a couple of other things that you should really keep in mind when you make that decision. One of them is the process, because the process is very different between producing offshore versus producing domestically. And that process is not just a matter of cost, it's a matter of time. Because think about it this way. When you produce offshore, and let's take China for example, the factory in China will have the capability to source the materials for you and order them and get them for your production. Obviously, you need to tell them what you want and they'll follow your requirements, but the legwork can be done by them. When you produce things domestically, factories only deal with laborers. So maybe just cut and sew, or sometimes just sewing, meaning that you or your team are the ones who are going to be responsible to source all the components, order them for production, and coordinate everything so it will get to the factory on time, so the factory can get your product in time. Now keep in mind, domestic factories will not start production unless they have all their components on hand, because the last thing that they want is to start production waiting for something, and all of a sudden there's a delay on that end, and then now they're stuck with production line that they can't finish. So when it comes to domestic production, there's a lot more legwork on your shoulders. There's a lot more coordination, especially if you have also printing or dyeing or embroidery. All these pieces adds to the complication and the complexity of your supply chain. Another thing to keep in mind is, because of that, when you get prices from offshore, from a factory, again, let's take China, for example, the price that you will get from that factory will be what we call full package price, meaning it will include labor and materials. One price, everything is included. When you produce domestically, you're going to need to be the one who's putting the cost of the product together, because you're the one who's sourcing the materials. It's going to be on you to figure out the pricing of all these components and how much is being used for each product, and really put together your own cost sheet together. Okay, something that again contributes to time, knowledge, to understand how to do that, and it can impact the complexity of the process. The last part that I want to touch on is the shipping cost and shipping time, because there are differences here again between offshore and domestic. When I'm producing offshore, factory will give me a price that will be either FOB, meaning freight on board, or ex factory. What that means? FOB means that the factory is only going to be responsible to deliver the goods to your courier. So for example, if you're shipping ocean, they will be responsible to deliver the goods to the port. Ex factory means that they're not even responsible for that. That means that you or your courier will need to go and pick up the goods directly from the factory, which means that in both of these cases, the shipping cost, getting it from the factory to your warehouse, is an extra cost to what your product cost is. And the tricky part about this is that depending on how you're shipping, air or ocean, depending on the quantities as well, these costs can actually be significant and can add quite a lot of cost to your end product. Not to mention that on top of it, you should really calculate for duties and taxes, custom taxes, because these will come in place as well. And let's say if you get a price quote from your courier who will do the actual shipping, they will not give you an idea of or even the cost of what the custom duties will be. That is something you need to keep in mind and make sure that you have allocated costs for that, because again, something that costs, you know, X dollars just to get it made in the factory might end a lot more when it's landed here.